Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Improving and Expanding Access to Transit. We'll discuss effective examples of expanding transit access and actionable items you can apply for your own city. We'll also review the recently published guidebook, Fight for Your Ride, an advocate's guide for improving and expanding transit. If you have any technical difficulties or questions, just please place it in the chat box as I will monitor it throughout the presentation. Our speaker today is Dan Levine from Transportation for America. Welcome, Dan. Great to have you here.
Thanks.
Dan leads efforts on state and local transportation policy. He recently launched T for America's State Transportation Advocacy Research and Training Network to aid legislators, advocates, and local stakeholders in advancing legislation to boost funding and empower local initiatives. He also manages the Transportation Innovation Academy, which arms local elected businesses and civic leaders with the tools to realize their regional transportation visions. I'm Diana Dakik from TransitScreen. I support efforts throughout North America, Canada, and parts of Europe to adopt innovative transportation solutions with a focus on multimodal transportation planning, demand management, parking reduction, and market-based policies that improve access of transportation options. So today on the call, we have public agencies, commercial developers, nonprofit organizations, planning organizations, research institutions, employers, transportation management associations, and TDM professionals. Welcome, everyone. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. All guests have been placed on mute. We'll hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so please direct your questions to the chat box. This webinar will be recorded and we'll follow up with presentation slides and resources after the webinar. Okay, so let's jump right in. Let's begin. At a time when one of the most prominent American companies, Amazon, has made it clear that transit is an essential component for choosing a site for a second headquarters, the federal government is disengaging on their once historic role as a funding partner for transit projects. Amazon's clear preference to locate their new HQ2 in a city with acceptable transportation access and a robust transit network is supporting the needs of a future American workforce, a workforce that is seeking vibrant, walkable, connected communities to work and live in. APTA, the American Public Transportation Association, has reported that millennials use an average of 3 transportation options in a typical trip. That's bike share, car share, and public transit. And this is an increasing trend. Now, we're all aware that useful transit is essential for cities to thrive. Transit supports development and economic growth while mitigating congestion. It reduces greenhouse gas emissions and provides affordable choices so that citizens can access jobs and services without the expense of a private vehicle. Companies are increasingly looking into more locations that have access to transportation options to recruit this talented workforce, and cities, whether in the running for Amazon or not, are realizing that investing in a range of transportation options has the potential to increase economic development. It's critical to attracting talent and the corporations that follow. So to build broad prosperity and improve access to opportunity for everyone, each region must build a transportation network that helps citizens reach jobs and services even without a car. Like few other tools, transit can physically stitch together a region to expand access, connect workers and employers, while also building strong neighborhoods and communities. So the question of the day is, Dan, what are some tangible steps that local champions can take in the short term to improve transit service?
Well, thanks, Diana. That's a really important question, and that's really why our new transit guidebook, Fight for Your Ride, that's what we help to answer. We know that cities big and small are looking to improve and expand transit for all the reasons you mentioned, to attract business relocations and recruit talented workers, to connect residents to jobs and opportunities, to foster economic and community growth. You mentioned Amazon. That's been a huge and very public example, but we've looked at this with all types of businesses. We put out a report a couple of years ago looking at 500 businesses that have relocated in recent years. The vast majority of them moving into downtowns or into walkable communities, looking for places that are served by transit where their workers will have options for getting to work. So we know that that cities are looking at ways to improve transit, build these types of communities, but especially in communities that have few transit options today or have very limited service, where do you start? What can you do that will have a quick impact? So I'll focus mostly on some of the local actions that you can take in your community or your city or your region. But really the first thing that I hope everyone on the webinar today, the first thing you can do is let your federal representatives know that improving transit is a priority for your community. The federal government's been a major partner in funding new transit construction and funds the ongoing maintenance of transit systems. However, in the first two budget proposals from the Trump administration, the administration has called for zeroing out the funding for new transit and for other community transportation priorities. We're pushing back against that. I have seen some progress in Congress to continue to fund those programs, but we need your help. You can help ensure that your city and state have a federal partner for your transit plans by speaking up for this funding. We have a sign-on letter going around right now with over 200 groups and elected officials on. I hope you can all sign on to that. We'll be sending that letter up to federal appropriators. And there's more that you can do in your city or in your district. Organize a transit meeting or a forum with local businesses to share how employers depend on transit. Invite your representatives, your federal representatives, but also state city councilors. Invite them to ride on transit or visit a transit-served business or community. Meet with your transit agency leadership or board, understand what initiatives they have underway that you can highlight, and develop a platform for local transit improvements. Those are just some of the first steps that you can take.
Yeah, it's very important to urge your representatives to preserve funding for transit and for leadership to locally improve your local transit systems by expanding and improving services. And like you said, your local transit success also depends on continued commitment from federal partners. So what are some things that local champions can do to establish successful federal partnerships and coalitions?
Yeah. Sure. I think building coalitions around transit is one of the most essential tasks in winning some political support to make improvements to transit, both to secure that funding at the federal level, but really to make the changes that we'll be talking about at the local and regional level. You need to start with support from local officials, community groups, business leaders, transit riders, and more really to affect some real change. Our guidebook lists many of the types of constituencies that you should look to engage in your effort. The good news for advocates is that better transit is really a cause that can unite diverse local constituencies. We regularly see business groups and developers partnered with labor and environmentalists and social equity groups, all united in a call for transit, a call for improved transit that can foster economic development, improve access to opportunity. It's really a unique issue that can bring people together from all sorts of different constituencies, united on a common goal. And really, engaging those groups early on in support of your efforts is key to the long-term success. So a great place to start is, identify the types of groups that you could work with. Start meeting with those groups, understand their goals and their needs, start building a transit plan or an advocacy platform that will have support from all these types of groups. Just as an example from the work that we've done with local communities, I worked earlier this year with a group of business and community leaders in Cincinnati to help them develop a platform for their campaign around transportation. A staff member for the Chamber of Commerce there who's leading the effort took that draft around to all sorts of community groups, to transit riders, to local elected officials, anyone else with a stake in better transit to get their input and to get really their buy-in in the campaign. And that meant that when the effort was announced, it wasn't a surprise to the key stakeholders, and there were already groups lined up to validate that message. We've seen, on the other hand, that there are examples of campaigns that have not been as successful, and oftentimes that's because the lead group in a campaign doesn't do the work early on to organize supporters, and opposition can spring up later on and start chipping off key constituencies, constituents that transit supporters may take for granted, but if they don't have a buy-in early in the campaign effort, they may not feel like it's a campaign for them, and they may not vote or come out to vote against an effort.
Yeah, so the key to success is building a winning coalition. You'll need a united force to succeed, and Better Transit can and should draw diverse advocates like you're suggesting. And like few other issues, the movement for better public transit has the potential to unite a broad coalition. In St. Louis, a grassroots-led campaign won broad support for transit by showing how everyone in the region would benefit from a system that would expand residents' access to jobs and opportunity. The campaign won on the simple message, transit, some of us ride it, all of us need it. So Dan, how can communication campaigns effectively improve transit?
Sure. Yeah, this is one of the best campaign tags we see in a transit campaign. This was part of a ballot measure campaign that was run in St. Louis, looking to raise new local funding, really just to preserve their transit service, stave off some pretty drastic cuts that were proposed to their transit service. But the message boils down a lot here. Transit, some of us ride it, all of us need it. It's a great tag, and in there are a few of the keys to really building an effective message about transit. This, one of the things we've seen in all of the messages that have been effective. So the first lesson there, I think, is just talking specifically about transit. We know public transit can be politically charged. There are all sorts of groups that will come out to oppose transit as social service. It's it funds labor. It's all sorts of reasons why public transit is charged, and I think that because of that, I've seen some transit advocates and supporters sort of back away from talking specifically about transit. They'll throw out sort of vague terms like mobility or a campaign just around transportation or something vague. But if you want to make public transit better for more riders, you really need to talk specifically about transit and about making transit better. I think the second part of the lesson really in this tag from St. Louis, the second part is that you need to make an honest case for how better transit will benefit people who don't regularly ride transit. In almost every city and region in the country, most people are not regular transit riders. They may occasionally ride, they may just watch the buses go by. You need to talk about transit in a way that those folks who are not daily riders will understand how transit is a benefit in their community. In St. Louis, they did this really well by highlighting how essential many transit riders are. So, they looked at people, they had, the face of their campaign was people like nurses and teachers, people talking about how, it was necessary for them to take transit to work, and they were a necessary part of the city's economy and society. In other campaigns and other places, advocates have told a compelling story about how transit will anchor community development, looking at sort of the economic development potential of transit, or about restoring and revitalizing communities. Or transit can be a part of a strategy for managing rapid population growth. A lot of regions are seeing tremendous growth, especially when they're looking at 10 or 15 years, and are looking at transit as a way to manage some of the traffic effects and growth effects from that. The point, though, is that many people in your community, they don't think that they'll ever ride transit, and you'll need that'll talk to them. One of the featured transit champions that we have in our report, in Fight for Your Ride, this guidebook, one of the champions his name is Christoph Spieler. He's a board member and a regular transit rider at Houston Metro. His top piece of advice for transit advocates is just to talk more about transit, talk more about what it does well and how it could be better. Christoph's work to redesign the Houston bus system is also a great example of one of the other key concepts in our guidebook, and that's to think about the rider's experience and use input from regular transit riders to decide what the most important needs are for your transit system.
Right, exactly. It's the easy way to find out what the system needs, just asking the riders. So if your plans for improving transit or proposing pricey expansions weren't sourced from existing or potential riders, they're likely to fail. And too often transit plans come from community leaders or transit board members that regularly ride or are not visiting the local transit or don't have like a good understanding of the mechanism to solicit useful feedback. So the surest way to assess your transit system's challenges is to begin building support for improvements, is to ask riders and potential riders about their experiences and what they need. Recent polling from Transit Center shows that top factors driving satisfaction with transit are service, frequency, and travel time. Riders are also valuing a station's conditions, stop conditions, real-time information, and service reliability. TransitScreen, the organization that I work for, we specialized in curating real-time transportation displays. And Transit Center found that in their report, Who's on Board 2016, that the most important first mile, last mile solution is walking. The majority of transit riders, including 80% of all-purpose riders, typically walk to transit. This finding underscores the importance of putting transit stations in busy, walkable neighborhoods, building offices and housing within walking distance of transit, because it provides a safer pedestrian route to transit, it plans for walkability. And essentially, when we start thinking about our cities more for people and adopting multimodality or walkability related measures, we're really considering the better aspect of how those can access transit more easily.
Yeah, so I think it would be a good time for me just to talk a little bit more about what our guidebook is all about. So we put out this guide, Fight for Your Ride. We looked at transit campaigns all across the country, both the campaign tactics, which I just talked a little bit about, coalition building a message, but also really what are the on the ground practical lessons that we can look at for quick, effective ways to make transit better. I hope some of the folks on the webinar are familiar with some of the big transformative changes, the new construction in places like Los Angeles or Seattle. They're building whole new transit systems, at the cost of billions of dollars. Those are great systems. They're going to really make a huge difference in those regions. But that's not the place that every region can start. And cities are looking for what are ways that they can start to make transit better, right away, and not quite at that cost. So we put together a lot of ways that regions have been effective in making transit better for riders, attracting more riders, making transit faster, making transit serve some of the key destinations, like getting to some of the job centers that have been disconnected from transit. That's really the meat of this guidebook, and I think it's a great place, to start to look for what can you do in your region to make transit better. So the guidebook covers really a whole range of transit improvements. So at one end of the spectrum, we have adding new transit service. That can be adding new lines, extending routes, adding hours of service, providing better service. For example, on weekends or late at night to serve riders who are commuting back from late shifts. So one of the examples here is from Seattle that added this night owl service, just adding more bus service late at night to serve a key group of riders that didn't have any options for service. And there's a whole set of examples here on just extending the routes, extending the hours of service. The next broad strategy that we highlight is changing transit routes to provide faster or more frequent service, or to better serve growing job centers. Travel patterns have changed substantially in most regions. We know there are more people commuting, for example, from suburb to suburb. We know there are more people commuting, not at regular 9 to 5 hours, but for different hours, and even not just Monday through Friday, but on the weekends. Well, these travel patterns have changed. The transit routes in most regions, for the most part, have not kept up. And so I mentioned earlier this example from Houston. Houston basically drew an entirely new map for their transit system, not just a new map, but a new set of routes for where their buses would go. Not a lot to really understand on this map, but what you should look at is just adding each one of those red lines is new frequent service. So at basically no net operating cost, just by moving around where they were serving, they were adding much more frequent service. And the results in Houston have been that they've seen, pretty constant bus ridership year over year since they implemented this new change, at a time when many other similar regions are actually seeing a decrease in bus ridership. Next in the report, in this guide, we highlight some examples of low cost, low barrier capital improvements that you can make to a transit system. So while some of the earlier examples were just about service, this is really getting into things that you put into the ground to start to make improvements. But these changes can be really small, can be really cheap, can be fast to put in, but can have a really major impact on the quality of service at just a fraction of the cost of something like a brand new rail line or bus rapid transit line. So an example of this is a new bus only lane launched in Everett, Massachusetts. It's a small city just outside of Boston. They launched this bus lane overnight. The city public works department came out, lined up a bunch of cones, put up some temporary signs, and made a bus lane, and was able to test it out, and overnight sped up the commutes by a few minutes along this busy corridor through the middle of their city. The last few categories that we highlight in the guidebook, the last types of ways that you can make transit improvements, they're really about making sure that people have access to transit, both physical and financial. Make sure that transit is accessible to the people who depend on it, and about better connecting transit with the places that people need to go, and in particular, some job centers. So Diana mentioned that the number one way that people get to and from transit is by walking. So if you want to make transit better or boost transit ridership, one of the important places to start is looking at improving sidewalks and station areas, making sure there are crosswalks at the stops, and supporting complete streets approaches to make sure that the areas around transit stops are safe and inviting for people who are walking to the stop, waiting at the stop. I have a few pictures here. I'll just pick on Indianapolis because it's a region I've worked with too. This is an Indigo stop. Here's another Indigo stop for their bus service. You'll see no sidewalks there. You can't see that this is along a 6-lane Washington Avenue with no crosswalk in front of it. It makes it really difficult for transit riders to get there. You see that people are still using the transit. It's a key service. This is a major corridor in Indianapolis, and one of their busiest bus routes. But a landscape like this makes it difficult for people who want to get to the bus. Further down that road, there's a stop where here you see there's a place for people to park their bike if they're biking to the stop. There's a bench and a covered shelter there for people waiting for the bus. There's a sidewalk. There's a light and a crosswalk to get to the stop. This is what you should be looking at transit stops if you want to make transit accessible and inviting for people to use the service. It's not just running a bus that's important, but make sure that people can get to that bus, that they have a safe place to wait for the bus. There are a few examples in this guide that kind of show how to do that. So way at the grassroots end, there's a group called the MARTA Army in Atlanta, all volunteer grassroots group. They've gone around adopting stops, get volunteers to clean up the stops, put up some new signage to help people find their way along the bus routes that stop there. Through their advocacy, have gotten the city to come in and pick up the trash from the trash cans that they set out at the bus stops, all looking to make the MARTA bus stops a more inviting place and a better experience for riders. And, at the other end of this is the work that TriMet has done. TriMet's the transit agency for Portland, Oregon, and the region. They have a whole complete streets program that's looked at their bus stops, analyzed where people are coming from, and worked with the county or the cities that are putting in the sidewalks, the crosswalks, to make sure that their bus stops are well served by infrastructure to help people get there on foot or on bike. So looking at the ability to walk or bike to a bus stop is key. We know though that there are places that walking or biking isn't really a feasible way to get to and from the bus stop. And so we have examples in this guidebook too of great places that have sort of extended the reach of transit by making those key last mile connections. Transit can't go everywhere. There are places like office parks or warehouses or low density areas where walking isn't really the solution. And so here's one example. There's an example from Groveport, Ohio. It's a small city sort of in the exurban fringe of Columbus, Ohio, but it's seen a really large growth in recent years of warehousing and logistics jobs. Chances are, if you've gotten something shipped to your house recently, it's passed through Groveport. I just sent a box back to Amazon, and it had a label of Groveport. This is it's an area of warehouses, and as you can imagine, that's a difficult landscape for transit to serve really well. It's by definition has to be spread out. But because there's been all this growth here, there's a huge demand for getting new workers there, and there are types of jobs that provide great opportunities for people, especially at the lower end of the education scale. But those folks have to be able to get to the jobs. And so the transit agency there, CODA, in partnership with these cities, with the city of Groveport, launched this shuttle, picks up at the last stop on the CODA bus line, so people can ride out from Columbus, get off the bus, get on the shuttle that's timed with the shift changes at these businesses. And the shuttle sort of makes that last mile connection to get people exactly where they're going, helps people connect to these jobs. We've seen some more high-tech solutions. I'll pull out just a couple examples from a couple suburban areas outside of Denver, two cities, Lone Tree and Centennial, Colorado. So in Lone Tree's launched a pilot program with Uber. Actually, it's sort of out of the pilot phase already. They've expanded the program. But they're providing on-demand rides to and from the city's light rail stations and around other destinations in the city. They're really using this on-demand shuttle to replace their circulator bus service, which didn't have a lot of riders, but provides a key service for people who don't have other transportation options. So they've entered this partnership. In this case, it's with Uber. People can pull up their Uber app, request a free ride on the Link on-demand shuttle. Shuttle will come around, pick them up, drop them off. It's subsidized by the city and provides that transportation service. As I said, there's a similar program in Centennial. That's a neighboring city in Colorado. They ran a pilot program with Lyft. And other regions are testing these types of micro transit service, which provides on-demand service for people based on apps on their phone. Pinellas County, Florida has partnered with Uber to provide late night service after transit stops running for shift workers. Los Angeles and West Sacramento in California and Arlington, Texas. All three of those cities are developing first mile, last mile programs in partnership with VIA. Summit, New Jersey has a program to provide rides to and from their downtown commuter rail station. So that's helping commuters get to the station to ride into New York or other destinations, and it's also helping to alleviate the parking demand at that station, which is right in downtown Summit.
Yes, and Lyft has been working with Detroit and cities along the Bright Line Passenger Railway in South Florida to help with last mile, first mile connectivity as well.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of these connections because, as I said, transit can't go everywhere, and these new technologies we think can be a real way to extend that reach. In most of these cases, it's still really at the pilot phase. It's hard to know exactly what the results will be, but it is encouraging to see cities try to test some of this out. The last kind of lesson here around accessibility that I want to highlight from our guidebook. Physical mobility, it's really a key to economic mobility. So transportation can allow people to access jobs, access essential services, and other opportunities. So it's critical that we make public transit available, especially for people who can't drive or don't have access to their own vehicles. It's critical to make sure that transportation options are affordable to the low-income riders who could most benefit from transit service. So in this guide, we highlight in one of the detailed case studies a really impressive campaign in Boston that was led by grassroots youth advocates and activists, a multi-year campaign to make changes to the youth fare program on the T, the transit system in Boston. At the end of this campaign, it was successful, and for a very small overall cost, the T has been able to provide low-cost fare passes for youth riders, including riders who are sort of just out of school, opening up access to after-school programs, to other for youth to get to jobs and to other programs. We've seen some similar campaigns around fair youth fairs in Oregon and Washington, some other places. This was, an ongoing campaign, as I said, over years, led by youth advocates from neighborhoods in Boston, who saw this really as a key equity issue, a way for them to access the services and economic opportunities around the Boston region. The trains were running, the buses were running, needed access to get onto those transit options. This campaign is also really a great lesson to bring us back to an important lesson from this guidebook, and that's that, to make change, to improve transit, you need to build a sustained campaign. You need to work with a diverse group of community advocates, even advocates you might not expect, and you need to show the potential of public transit. And I think, for folks on this webinar who are thinking about how to make, any of the improvements I just listed, think about making those improvements through really a campaign in your community. It may not take an election, but it does take, organizing the types of constituencies that will see a benefit, organizing them, getting a clear message, making the case to, whether it's the leadership of your local transit agency, or whether it's your city or county or state government. You need to make a compelling argument for why it's important to make transit better, why it's worth investing in transit if it's something that's going to take more money to realize, and what it'll mean if you make those improvements.
So we're going to wrap up with this quote before we open up for Q&A. Charles Dyer Norden, professor of regional planning and urbanism and chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design at Harvard University Graduate School of Design, has said that transformative change ultimately came when the implementation of a particular policy also enhanced governmental capacity to plan and make transport policy change by involving many stakeholders over a variety of territorial scales. The interactive dynamic of the process of stakeholder involvement and the relationship between governing authorities and transportation policy advocates are key. They're essential to making transformational change beyond just the paper success of policy change. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask us now, go ahead and type it into the chat box. We'll give you a few moments and we'll hold a brief Q&A session.
Look forward to questions. I think I'll just mention two in closing. I just want to mention some of the work that we at Transportation for America are working on to really help cities advance these solutions. Building off just what Diana just said, it's important to kind of build campaigns, but then build the right solutions that help cities to have success. So through some leadership academies and trainings, we've helped city leaders and transit champions understand how to make these cost-effective improvements to their transit systems. We've helped to build the political will really to bring these plans to reality. Right now, through our Smart Cities Collaborative, we're working with 45 agencies across 24 communities who are really at the forefront of developing policies and programs to incorporate new mobility technologies into their transportation networks. We'll also be hosting a conference, our Capital Ideas Conference, in December in Atlanta. That's all about helping state legislators and advocates understand the role, especially for states in this time of transportation disruption, both policy disruption and new technology that's changing the way transportation works. So there are lots of ways that we at Transportation for America want to keep working with you and support your efforts in your communities.
So the Transportation for America Guidebook, Fight for Your Ride, an advocate's guide for improving and expanding transit, offers practical advice for making real improvements to public transit. We're going to follow the guidebook with everyone that has attended today's webinar. We'll share more examples of successful campaigns that you could apply in your region. and will illuminate more effective ways to speed up transit, expand its reach, and improve service for riders. This is a toolkit, and it serves local advocates that want to improve public transportation services and accessibility in their communities. We hope that you find it easy to use, and if you have any questions about it, you can always follow up with Dan at dan.levine@tforamerica.org.
Yeah, so there's a question in about how much each of these small improvements will cost. It's a great question. We have some information about that in our guide, and I'm happy to follow up. I can't see who's asking that, but send me an email, and I'm in particular if you're looking at any one of these projects, and I can find out from the agencies exactly what the cost was. We have some information about the relative cost of some of these improvements, and as I said, we especially look to highlight some of the improvements that transit agencies or cities can make, at virtually no cost beyond sort of the planning. So, if you look at the work to kind of string up cones to build a bus lane, that's a pretty minimal capital cost, and they then had the state come in and build a permanent bus lane after that pilot proved successful. If you look at the example from Houston about remapping their entire bus service, they were able to provide, as I said, much more frequent bus service along some key corridors without any impact on the net operating cost, just by moving, shifting their resources around and moving buses to different routes.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your time today, and thank you, Dan, for presenting. We learned a lot from you, and we gained a lot of insight. So we will follow up with the guidebook, and we'll share additional resources that we discussed today in the webinar. And if you have any additional questions, just feel free to contact us. I'm Diana at TransitScreen.com, and Dan is at dan.levine, Levine, at tforamerica.org. We hope that you'll have a great day today, and I'll be in touch with you all soon.
Thanks so much.